Okay, now it's my, again, honor and privilege to present the first selected speaker, Roberto Fumagalli, that will talk to us about minimal models and minimal results.
Thank you so much, and thanks again for welcoming here. I'm truly delighted to share thoughts with you about this topic. So let me just dive directly into it. So philosophers and scientific modelers frequently rely on models to articulate and assess model claims about real-world targets. However, disagreement remains as to whether consideration of a particular class of models, namely minimal models, actually can enable us to provide model knowledge about the world. And minimal models are defined in the following way. Are models that lack any similarity, isomorphism, or resemblance about the world, are unconstrained by natural laws, and do not isolate any real factor. So the basic idea is that by relying on consideration of these models, we will putatively be able to justifiably affect confidence in necessity or impossibility hypotheses about real-world targets. Now, unsurprisingly, seems quite a contentious thesis. There are two main camps in the literature. On the one hand, we have the proponents of the thesis that we can actually manipulate and build on these models, and on the other hand, we have those who actually deny that by consideration of these minimal models, we can actually provide model knowledge about the world. And you can see me squarely in the opponent kind of claim, so to speak. Now, over the last few years, an interesting proposal has been put forward. The basic idea is that some proponents of this use of minimal models argue that by eating the distinction between two particular kinds of possibilities, namely epistemic possibilities and objective possibilities, we are actually able to show that considerations of minimal model can provide model knowledge, and therefore we dissolve the disagreement between the proponents and the opponents, like myself, of the use of minimal models to provide model knowledge. And the main claim of these authors, which I will claim MEM, is that basically is that model epistemology means minimal model, just to explain the acronyms, is that consideration of minimal models enable scientific modelers to ground justified claims of objective possibility about a real-world target. Now, if correct, this thesis would have widespread implication about both philosophy and scientific practice more widely, because objective possibility and claims and assessment of objective possibility are articulated and assessed in a wide range of different areas in philosophy, from metaphysics to philosophy of mind, but also in a wide range of scientific disciplines. I mean, I think biology, philosophy, economics, physics, and the like. And what I'd like to do in this paper together with you today is to combine insights from scientific modeling and model epistemology to critically assess these MEM theses. And in particular, I'll try to defend my original claim that consideration of minimal models cannot provide any model knowledge about real-world target. And I'll try to defend this claim of mine against a series of different objections that a proponent in sense of this use of minimal models may put forward. So the structure of the paper is very, very similar. First, I'll try to explicate briefly the case for MEM, and highlighted in one putative example of minimal models selected by the proponents of this thesis. I will then explicate my own critique of MEM and try to illustrate it with this very same example chosen by the proponents of MEM. And then I'll go over with some objections and reply. These are all the ones that are in the paper. In the interest of time, I'll be shot down after I cover 4 of them. The first of them focuses on the relationship between the model world that scientific modelers often imagine or think about or postulate and real-world targets. The second objection focuses on the account of representation that is putatively presupposed by my critique of minimal models. The third one focuses on the kind of possibility and on a particularly weak type of possibility out of which we might get some knowledge of objective possibility about the world, namely the notion of logical possibility. And the final objection I'll be able to cover today examines a putative redefinition of minimal model, a more relaxed definition of minimal models than the literal one I examined together with you. And with that, I'll close. So briefly, how does the case of for the use of minimal models to provide model knowledge works? This basic case builds on the distinction between epistemic and objective possibility as follows. On the one hand, a particular proposition or state of affair is epistemically possible for a particular agent if this appeal is consistent with the agent knowledge about what is actually the case. So it's all about the consistency with the knowledge of a particular agent, individual or group at a particular time, and the claim that is being done. On the other hand, a particular state of affair or proposition is objectively possible if this describes one way the world could be, irrespective what knowledge is exactly possessed at a particular time by a relevant community of speakers or modelers. Now, just to elaborate briefly on this contrast, the truth value of claims of epistemic possibilities depends on which agents exactly are involved. Is it you, is it me, is all of us taken collectively, and exactly what type of knowledge is possessed by each and every one of the relevant agents involved. Therefore, establishing that a particular P is epistemically possible for some specific agent requires us to determine the consistency of this P with the knowledge possessed by them. On the other hand, as we say, the truth value of claims of objective possibilities does not depend on what knowledge is possessed by any specific agents, and in fact, as a result of this, we may establish that a particular P is objectively possible while disregarding or even contradicting some of the knowledge that is possessed by the relevant agent. That's the critical distinction between these two types of possibility. Now, the case for MEM that I'm going to criticize later builds on this distinction as follows. Minimal models, as we defined them before, typically include a number of idealizations that contradict, deviate, or even just disregard a lot of the knowledge we happen to possess. By idealization, I mean a wide variety of different modeling techniques, such as Aristotelian idealization, Galilean idealization, and the like. There are a variety of them, but what unifies, makes them tokens of the same type, so to speak, is that they abstract away, they contradict, they omit, they flatly contradict some of the knowledge that we possess. Now, because minimal models include these idealizations, they are actually unable to ground justify claims of epistemic possibility. This is admitted by the proponents of MEM. And this is because grounding justify claims of epistemic possibility requires models that are compatible with what modelers know. But here is the twist, here is why they introduce this distinction between the two types of possibility. The inclusion of idealization by itself does not hamper in any way the potential of these models to ground justify claims of objective possibilities, because many objective possibilities are counterfactual, and grounding justify claims of objective possibilities often actually requires models of non-actual targets. As a result, so they claim, consideration of minimal models can enable modelers to ground justify claims of objective possibility about real-world targets. Just for the sake of clarity, I speak of grounding justify claims of objective possibility, but take it as a synonym of substantiate, okay? I don't want to get into that sort of debate about grounding. So if that's confusing, just take it as a synonym for substantiate justify claims of objective possibility. Here is one very, very simple and quick example. Many of you will know it already. Schelling, the economist, not the German idealist, checkerboard model of racial segregation. I had to specify this in one of my courses because some students thought, wow, this guy really had a lot of different ideas. Well, maybe not, right? In a particular model, we have two different types of tokens that are distributed randomly over a particular checkerboard. Think of them in white and red tokens. Now, the model has a particular dynamic. Each agent sequentially chooses whether to stay where they are or move to a nearby unoccupied cell, depending on whether their own preferences not to be in the minority in the neighborhood they live in is satisfied or not. And the dynamics works in such a way that one after the other, the agents keep choosing until all of their preferences not to be in the minority in the neighborhoods they live in is actually satisfied. And then the model basically stops and we get the result. Now, this model does not aim to accurately represent the segregation dynamic that may happen in any concrete real-world city, and assumes away a number of factors that we know actually generate segregation in the real world. I mean, for instance, he assumes away the fact that many people, unfortunately, do have racist preferences. He assumes away, I feel like, economic or disparities in terms of the wealth or the income generated by people that can also generate segregation, gentrification, and so on. So does not ground justify claims of epistemic possibility. However, here is the thought. This kind of model shows that it is objectively possible that individuals' preferences, very mild preferences not to be in the minority in the neighborhood they live in, actually can cause segregation. So it really does ground a justified claim of objective possibility about particular targets. Here is my critique of MEM, and I'll expand on this for a couple of slides before covering one after the other a few objections against my critique, so a few potential replies against me. So let me start with a couple of observations that I think are quite helpful to see how the dialectical space actually works here. The proponents of man that I'm about to criticize acknowledge that in order for us to grant justified claims of objective possibility, one needs to provide evidence that so-and-so is a particular the way the world that actually could be. And in particular, they admit that the onus is on them to specify the condition under which a particular model is a reliable tool for elicit information about possibilities, namely to provide us with actual model knowledge about the world. And I have a problem with men building on these sorts of claims. And the problem is that I think that consideration of minimal models, at least as we define them, and I'll get back to this later, may ground justified claims of objective possibilities about model worlds. Now, what are model worlds? Model worlds are the imaginary, fictional, even counterfactual scenarios or states of affairs that modelers may build in their own hand or in hyper kind of abstract simulations, let's say. However, grounding justified claims of objective possibilities about real-world targets as opposed to model worlds would require us to supplement minimal models with quite a lot of information or presupposition of how exactly the world actually works. But if that's the case, the claim that consideration of minimal models themselves as opposed to consideration of empirical knowledge about the world is actually what is grounding justified claims of objective possibility does not withstand scrutiny. Here in more detail how my reasoning goes. So minimal models, as we define them, or they define them at the beginning, at least in a literal sense, they lack any similarity, isomorphism, or resemblance about the world. They are unconstrained by natural law. They do not isolate any real-world factors. I mean, without information or presupposition about real-world targets, I think, modelers building just on these models will lack evidential or epistemic access, epistemic information to determine what is objectively possible in the real world. So they will actually lack the information that is required to show that what is objectively possible in these very abstract, imaginary, counterfactual model worlds is also objectively possible in the real world. I mean, that something might be objectively possible in a model world, such as a round square, doesn't actually entail that it is objectively possible in the real world targets that we actually want to investigate and examine. So consideration of minimal model, I think, cannot provide us with any reasons to justifiably infer that what is objectively possible in model world is also objective. So they cannot really bridge the gap in terms of objective possibility claims between what we imagine, what we think might possibly be the case, and what is actually the case or could be the case out there. So modelers, I think, must supplement minimal models with some information or presupposition about the real world to grant these sorts of justified claims about real world targets that they mentioned. But so consideration of minimal models themselves cannot ground justified claims of objective possibility about the world. Just to come back to this beautiful example of our German idealist friend, so suppose for the sake of argument that the Schelling model actually is a minimal model. Now, on this supposition, which is something that I'm happy to discuss with you, consideration of this model may ground justified claims of objective possibility about abstract segregation processes. Namely, the abstract segregation processes are the ones that happen in this beautiful two-dimensional checkerboard that we play with our token. But consideration of these kind of models does not show to us that it is objectively possible that the same can actually happen in the real world. And in particular, grounding these sorts of abstract claims that abstract segregation is objectively possible does not entail us to derive exactly the same result in the actual world targets that we are actually interested in. So consideration of the Schelling model on the supposition that the model is minimal cannot ground justified claims of objective possibility about the real world without at least supplementing this model, without injecting some empirical information or presupposition of how exactly the actual world target function, what their components are, what their dynamics are, and so on. Now that concludes in a nutshell the proposal I'm criticizing, the kind of a critique, at least first blood, that I put forward. In what follows the last 10 minutes, I'd say, let me go over briefly 4 potential objections you may have or concerns that you may have about what I say, and then we continue our discussion, hopefully friendly discussion in Q&A. So here is the first objections that you may have, or the main concern that you may have. These target the relationship between these model worlds that I mentioned and real world targets. So the basic thought you could have is the following. Come on, Roberto, go very slowly, because modelers, as you hopefully know, can ground a host of justified claim of objective possibility about the world just by consideration of imaginary worlds, without having to specify, not to say determine or establish, what relationship of similarity, isomorphism, or resemblance actually holds between these model worlds and the real world. I mean, we often do it in all the time in science, that we don't stay there and take the fuss of specifying exactly the relationship between our model worlds and the target. Now, my reply goes as follows. I'm willing to grant what I'm granting is always in red here, and what I object to is in orange, just to keep ourselves awake. I'm willing to grant that modelers do not always determine the relationship between models and real-world targets in scientific practice. Just there is a huge collection of examples we may provide here. However, I think it's important to note that the mere fact that modelers do not explicitly determine what relationship exactly holds between a model and target exclude that there actually are some similarity, isomorphism, resemblances if we happen to investigate and explore these cases. And in particular, the alleged fact that modelers can ground claims, justify claims of objective possibility about real-world targets when this sort of relationship is uncertain, unspecified, undetermined, by no means entails that they can actually do so when there is no relationship of that sort. And this is the critical claim you have to support, to substantiate, if you have to grant the claim that consideration of minimal models are actually what is actually granting justified claims about the world. Second objection. The second objection concerns the account of representation that is putatively presupposed by my critique. So the concern will go as follows. Roberto goes very slowly because some of the things you say may be actually mischievously presuppose a specific and contested account of representation that someone may actually reasonably deny or resist. So the thought in particular is that on so-called inferential accounts of representation, consideration of models and putatively including minimal models can enable modelers to perform valid surrogative reasoning about their target without having to specify any particular relation. In fact, you could say they enable you to perform valid surrogative reasoning in the absence of any specific similarity or other sorts of relation. Now, again, I'm willing to grant that if my case against these sorts of use of minimal models rested on any specific and contested account of representation, you could resist this case my critique by basically resisting the account of representation that I'm presupposing. However, I don't think that anything in what I say directly commits me to any specific account of representation or other. In particular, and I think actually this spells quite a lot of problem on that, even if you point to this inferential account of representation that many of them seem to like and favor, this does not actually support this MEM claim in favor of minimal models. And the reason is that although consideration of minimal models may enable us to perform valid surrogative inferences, namely inferences that are actually derived in accordance with the rule of inference specified for a particular model, it does not enable us to demonstrate that these inferences are not just valid, but also true of the target. And that's the critical notion, the critical step that they need to substantiate. Not just that some kind of inference is simply derived in light of the rules specified by the models, but actually that these rules of inference can tell us something about the world, namely that is true or possibly true in the objective possibility sense about the real world. In fact, in this case, it's quite telling is that even main proponents of the inferential accounts of representation, take Mauricio Suarez, for instance, emphasize that if you really have to constrain your inference such that they're telling something about the world, some sorts of mapping is actually required between model and target. This is compatible with the original claim of the inferential account that just with regard to validity, you may not have to presuppose any account. But when it comes to truth, you do need to impose some constraint. Third and penultimate objection, the objection from logical possibility. Here the thought is that, again, that I'm missing something or misinterpreting in some respect the use that is actually made by these minimal models. And the thought is the following. Look at how we do when we do minimal modeling in science. Some of these models simply depict possible worlds. And consideration of these minimal models can ground justify claim of a very weak type of objective possibility, which is logical possibility. But if this is the case, contrary to what my critique states, we can actually ground justify claim of objective possibility, namely logical possibility about the world. Now, I'm actually willing to grant that consideration of minimal models can ground at least some claims of logical possibility about the world. This is the sense in which my paper is not titled Minimal Models No Result, but Minimal Models Minimal Result. Now, why is this really minimal and uninteresting results, I think? I think that grounding some logical possibilities about the world does not enable us to ground any justified claim of objective possibility in the sense presupposed by man, because logical possibility is much less restricted than any kind of objective possibility we are interested in science. Even take nomological possibility is much more restricted than logical possibility. Think of even more restricted types of objective possibility that we target in science, economic, physical, biological possibilities. All of these are massively more restricted than the hyper-broad, the hyper-lax notion of logical possibility that this claim points at. So I think that establishing logical possibility by itself does not enable us to grant any claims of more restricted kind of objective possibility that are of interest of science. So I take it to be that if logical possibility was all that they actually meant and referred to, this amounts to a great dilution of their thesis and almost a trivialization. Final objection, and this might actually be one of the concerns that some of you in this room might have had since slide number 2. So this is the objection from the redefinition of the notion of minimal model. Here is the thought. Roberto, you're really a fundamentalist, a literalist. You lack any exegetical sensitivity to what these authors actually meant at the very beginning. Namely, the original definition of minimal models is not plausibly interpreted literally, Roberto. And in fact, we proponents of minimal models can redefine the notion of minimal models in a more plausible and interesting sense. Namely, we redefine the set of minimal models so that they include both literal models, like per your own fundamentalist interpretation, but just also a lot of highly idealized models we use in science. So think, for instance, models that assume away many of the factors that we know are operating in a particular target, as per Aristotelian idealization, for instance. Now, suppose that we redefine the set of minimal models in this broad sense, so that it includes not just literally minimal models, but also highly idealized models. Now, let's redefine this notion, this thesis, as MM star to differentiate it from the original men that have been concerned so far. Again, I'm very willing to grant that this MM star is far less controversial than men. But the problem is that this thesis, which is basically grounded on a much wider interpretation of minimal models, trivializes the issue whether consideration of minimal models can ground justify claims about the world, because it redefines the set of minimal models, the notion of minimal models, in such a way that the number of models that have already been shown to ground justify claims about the world and objective possibility counts as minimal models. I mean, just think of Uskalimakian highly idealized models, but even before 2009, plenty of people would be perfectly willing to grant you that consideration of highly idealized models can ground you justify claims of objective possibility about the world. So you notice how the dialectic work here. I think that with these sorts of consideration, we are laterally led towards a dilemma for the proponents of man. Either they go for a literal interpretation of this thesis, namely a thesis that is presupposed on the literal, very strict definition of minimal models I mentioned, but then the thesis to me sounds completely implausible. Or you go for a reinterpretation of these sorts of theses that redefines the notion of minimal models in more relaxed terms. But then I think that this kind of move makes them vulnerable to trivialization in the technical sense that these results will be straightforwardly derivable from all sorts of things we know in scientific modeling from well before this thesis was first put forward. So the dilemma is either you go literal and you have actually implausibility, or you actually relax this hyper-strict definition of minimal model they started for, but you're naturally led into some of the existing kind of proposition and many well-known results in scientific modeling that were widely available before this thesis was put forward. To conclude, and hopefully just in time, in recent years, some leading authors have built on this interesting distinction between epistemic and objective possibility to salvage this kind of original claim that consideration of minimal models can actually provide model knowledge about real-world targets. What I try to do in this paper is to combine insights from scientific modeling and model epistemology to defend my original claim, and again against these sorts of new attempt of them, that consideration of minimal models cannot provide us with any model knowledge about real-world target against a series of quite diverse objections. Now, just to make clear, this by no means excludes that in science we can get all sorts of interesting results about the real-world target by consideration of highly idealized models. I'm perfectly happy with this. I often do it as a economically trained philosopher in my own practice. But this provides us reason, I think, to relinquish once and for all this original stringent definition of minimal models, to dispense with it, and to really ground or focus, let's say, the debate about scientific modeling on more informative notions of models. Thank you so much for the attention.
Okay, so yeah, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. So basically, I have a potential response about the criticism about logical possibility, right? So you say that because these things, I mean, roughly, because these things are like so unconstrained, they belong to a kind of possibility that seems to be too relaxed, and appealing to that doesn't seem to be to do the trick, right? But like, I think you owe us, or you owe the defenders of NEM, right? Like an account of how do you account for the kinds of possibility. Like for example, if you're talking about like you mentioned economic possibility, right? Why aren't there very far-fetched possibilities also, right? Like how do we delimit that domain of possibilities, right? Because it doesn't, in principle, doesn't have to be any less, widespread or like than any other kind of possibility, right? So it still is about. So you can define that as like possibilities about a certain subject matter, right? But then that they are about a subject matter doesn't necessarily mean that they cannot be very far-fetched or whatever, right? Like if you go to a utopia or something like that, right? Like the economic facts and everything there will be very different from here, but still there are economic facts and possibilities, right? So that will be a potential response, I feel, to the kind of criticism that you're raising.
Great. This is a good question in the sense that it enables me to clarify a couple of things about the dialectical background. All these notions of possibility that I mentioned are actually introduced by my friends, so to speak, okay? The people I'm criticizing in this way. So I'm not introducing them. They are actually introducing very neatly the distinction between logical possibility and more restricted types of possibility. Mm-hmm. And they grant in the first place that nomological possibility is more restricted than logical one. And they also say and emphasize that the logical, biological possibilities are more restrictive yet of the nomological and then of the logical. Now, somebody might call that into question. I'm just saying that I'm actually basically not in disagreement with them with regard to this point. Related to that, I think you touched on a very interesting question on how these more kind of particular kinds of possibilities constructed exactly. That's a very interesting question. And I also think that a number of very interesting distinctions may be put between different types of even discipline-specific possibility. For instance, I agree with you. There are senses in which so-called economic or social science-related possibilities might be more arbitrary or constructed or contested or context-dependent than space of possibilities that are built within the natural sciences. Why? For instance, because of the influence that some values may play in the social sciences that are no analog in the natural one, for instance. So I agree with you that there are lots of interesting things to say on how exactly each of these space of possibility ought to be built, and some interesting distinction between what are actually usually just paired as equivalent type of possibility. I agree with you, they might not. But for the purpose of my paper, the only thing I'm relying is on this nested conception of possibility, which is flatly proposed by them. So I'm not superimposing anything on their account of possibility or possibility space in that sense. Thank you.
Ottavio?
Thanks for the paper. I think I fully agree with the points you're making. And my question is on the objection about the inferential account and whether you're presupposing some kind of representation. It seems to me that in a way you are, both in the original response that you have and in the reiteration you gave today, because I take it that part of the worry is, look, if the minimal models in the original sense are correct, there's just no grounds whatsoever for them needing to represent anything, because there's no connection between the models and their targets. Now that does presuppose minimally, right, that there ought to be some kind of connection. Right, and that, in fact, it's reasonable to expect that. Mm-hmm. In a way, even in a very deflationary way that Suarez has. So if you look at his latest book, right, he says, well, yeah, all you need is just this denotation or something like that, right? So to account for the differential force of the inferences that the model allows. That is one kind of connection. It may not be substantive, but there is one, right? So, in that way, I think maybe you have to bite the bullet, right? And say, well, without, and say something like, without any such connections, we just don't have any representation, period. Right? And I think that's what that was the force of your original response, right?
Yeah, thanks. I try maybe to be more economic and uncommitted than what I actually am substances, but thanks. I'm keeping in mind on whether maybe to rephrase my response on that specific point. Thanks, Ottavio.
Sure.
Okay. Till ne-Yanoff was here last month, so
We missed each other.
I'm just checking if someone is ready to defend his position. Or you convince everybody.
They're not converts.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about the four other objections you didn't
Okay.
discuss?
Okay, so the other three objections are all of the same type. I'll talk briefly about them, and then I'll talk maybe briefly about an additional twist in the tail, so to speak. So the three different objections, they are quite similar in kind, because they all consider the possibility of grounding justified claims of objective possibility about the world by targeting not so much just model world generally, but specific type of targets. So they could be either minimal models of hypothetical targets, namely targets that, for all we know, may or may not exist in the world. So I was a few days ago at CERN in Geneva. Supersymmetric particle would be exactly one type of those hypothetical particles, or models of fictional targets, namely targets that we know do not exist, but their existence will not contradict any law of nature, so they could be nomologically possible. Think of the ether model, for instance, by Maxwell, or models of nomologically impossible targets, so models that not only we know are not existing, but we also know that if they were to exist, they will contradict the laws of nature as we know them. Think, I don't know, a model of a perpetual motion machine, or massive physical particles traveling faster than light. And in all of these cases, my reply actually goes along similar lines of what we've seen. I take each of these examples, and I say either the model is really minimal in a literal sense, you don't get all these kind of beautiful results that they claim you can get, or if you do actually get these results, it's because the model you start with was not actually minimal in the sense presupposed. Now, the interesting reply I got on this paper, because I tried to reply to them on the British Journal of Philosophy of Science, was basically that they say, oh, but in our novel proposal, and they manage, I mean, I don't know if it's them or some people in the research group, and I'm hoping to lay the cards on the table because I'm also welcoming suggestions, if you may, on how to deal with this issue, is that they say, yeah, the original papers were about minimal models, but our more up-to-date proposal is not specific about minimal models, so we are basically not replying to you. But that's extremely puzzling for a very, very specific claim that they do actually make in the paper repeatedly. And the paper, the claim that they actually make is exactly the following. Is the claim of dissolving this kind of disagreement that there was. So basically the dialectical context is the following. You have some early, very interesting and provocative papers about minimal models interpreted literally. I reply together with others saying, look, if this is what you mean by minimal models, you are not going to get these particular results. Very inventive new proposal. We can get interesting claims about objective possibility by distinguishing different kinds of possibilities. And here is now my response to them. Now, this intermediate kind of up-to-date maneuver by them would be very hard to understand what exactly they are supposed to dissolve or to resolve in terms of debate if we're not targeting the notion of minimal models. So I think it's a very interesting evasion move. Might be sufficient not to get into particular kind of venue to discuss with them. But I think it's a bit disingenuous on the part to say, actually, we are not meaning this claim about minimal models because, gee, you are telling me you're dissolving this debate. They cite me, they cite Reutlinger, they cite all the other people that were critical of minimal models. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to say that, well, maybe we are not concerned about minimal models anymore. You should really state it clearly and state exactly what is it that you're dissolving about the original argument and what is actually you're not engaging anymore. More generally, I think, the main message for me and the take-home message after talking of this, I really think that there was something over-ambitious in the very definition that was started with. I think that sort of definition is so extreme that it really introduced a lot of unnecessary discussion about this fascinating debate about scientific modeling. And we are really better off, I think, not just by pretending and not talk about them anymore, but with explicitly granting and acknowledging that that kind of definition is not helpful. And also, I think it's incumbent on them at that point to tell us exactly what redefinition of this original knowledge notion can do the work they mean without falling back in all the number of very interesting results we already have in the community of scientific modeling. That's the task, and I think it's a task for them, especially in light of this claim of having actually dissolved the previous disagreement about minimal models. Thank you.
there other question, comment? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, usually the killer arrives last. So
Or first, as it-
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be a potential wiggle room that I don't know if anybody would want to exploit, but between kind of what it takes to kind of extract some conclusion from a model. Like one view might be that kind of if you want to kind of get a conclusion from a model, the model by itself is not sufficient to get the conclusion. You need to enrich the model, kind of actually build the model up more and include the extra assumptions in it, so it's not minimal anymore. Or maybe like there's an alternative option of saying that kind of we can extract conclusions of the from a minimal model via like additional background assumptions, which aren't part of the model, but which are legitimate background assumptions to make when we're drawing conclusions from the model. So like your extra assumptions, they might try to say, are still relevant, but they don't need to be placed in the model. They can be part of kind of how we extract conclusions from the model. And so we're still right, it's still about minimal models. We can still get these conclusions from minimal models, but we just need the background assumptions for the extraction process. I don't know if there's really a distinction there, but it feels like one that could be used to try to sidestep.
There are distinctions made. In fact, I mean, some authors in their camp that are a bit more friendly, I think, and helpful in terms of remarks and feedback told me, yeah, Roberto, models don't happen in a vacuum. Yeah. So, of course, when you do use a model plus some kind of, pre-theoretical knowledge about the world, your awareness of a number of contextual facts and so on. But again, I think then it's up to them to tell us a non-trivial sense in which this happened, because if you build in this extra backward assumption, the assumptions that are needed in order to derive the results, it feels a bit cheating to me to say, well, it's consideration of minimal models that is granting claims of objective possibility about the world. It's actually your empirical information, your contextual information. And at that point, if you tell me, look, the conjunction of a minimal model plus empirical information derive my results, I'm perfectly fine with it, but I wonder at that point who exactly would deny that kind of particular claim. So I think I fully agree with you. Another way of interpreting this project is just try to preempt and provide a reconnaissance mission of all the possible ways in which that kind of original claim could be substantiated in a way that does not make the claim about minimal model completely uninteresting or trivial. Good. Thank you.
Is there another comment, question? So let's thank our speaker.